Today we have Tim Head with us, the executive director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and we're going to be talking about Georgia. Excited to have you here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's we are all becoming experts on Georgia politics across the country, aren't we?
We definitely are. All eyes are on Georgia right now because there is a runoff going on between Warnock and Herschel Walker. It'll be interesting to see how things are panning out. You know a lot about Georgia voters because many voters are conservative. This was traditionally a conservative state that has been swinging to the left. What do you think are the top things that Georgians are going to care about when casting their vote?
Well, it's a good question, and clearly there's kind of different layers or kind of rungs to these things. So obviously the the different kind of swaths, the basic swaths of Georgia voters are we've got a lot of very conservative, usually faith-based voters, usually evangelicals, a lot of Catholics as well, and then some other kind of smaller religious sects. So you've got kind of this large faith-based component, which at this point is a little over 75%, almost 80% of the Republican Party in Georgia, for the most part, are basically conservative faith-based voters. Then on the far left, you have very kind of ideological voters. Those are usually in city centers, although you're over in Augusta. There's a large university and medical school there in Augusta, the largest medical school in Georgia, and so there are a lot of people that are kind of tethered to the university and medical school over there in Augusta that are very interested in kind of like health spending and Medicaid expansion, things of that nature. And then you got sort of rural voters that historically had been, maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s, maybe were kind of blue dog Democrats that flipped over in the 2000s and 2010s to become more Republican voters, and they're more conservative generally speaking, but they may not be kind of ideological voters. They're more kind of they are heavily reliant, for instance, on the farm bill. Is one thing that a lot of people may not kind of think about in Georgia. A lot of peanut farmers. And other kinds of farmers and crops that are contemplated in the farm bill, and so that may kind of trend or tend a little bit more towards some kind of pro government kinds of voters there that are even though they're rural voters. So there's it's a little bit of there's some nuances to Georgia that may not always play out in other states.
Raphael Warnock goes by Reverend Warnock and calls himself a pro-choice pastor. Do you think that there is awareness that he is so radical for abortion?
Largely, the answer is yes. Although there, now that we're a week and a half, almost 2 weeks removed from the election, from the first election. We've seen that there were almost 200,000 voters in Georgia who voted for Brian Kemp, who also voted for Raphael Warnock, and so that's I don't know that that's necessarily those are pretty clearly were not overly like ideological or kind of public policy oriented voters. There's probably a lot of personality involved in that, and look, one of the hard things about the Warnock campaign against Herschel Walker is spent probably $125 to $135 million, really hammering Herschel Walker on some challenges that Walker had, 15, 16, 17 years ago in his family. And look, I mean, any kind of challenging story like that gets $120 million spent against it, it's going to reverberate in some corners of the state. So out of 4 million voters, the votes that were cast, 3.96 million voters roughly that were cast in December. I'm sorry, in November. When almost 200,000 of those kind of listened carefully to those Warnock hit pieces. That's all it takes. He won by, or he has a lead of almost 40,000, 38,000 votes. So I do think it's important for more and more Georgians, those last kind of 200,000, if you will, to get the memo that that Herschel Walker is indeed a pro-life. He carries life in his own personal values and would do so in his public life and as a public servant, whereas Raphael Warnock has now a clear demonstrated history, not only rhetorically but on in his votes, of being pretty rabidly pro-choice. As a matter of fact, not just kind of in a few kind of challenging exceptions. He across the board is just he is a pro-choice, and frankly, I would just argue a pro-abortion candidate.
It's interesting that you mentioned the lead. A lot of that is due to that they started early voting only in democratically heavy areas on Saturday, and all of early voting across Georgia started today. So we saw Cobb County, they started early voting. They are more heavily Democratic. That is Atlanta. And then here in Augusta, they were not able to start early voting until today. Do you think that there is an agenda behind that?
Well, I don't know that there's an agenda. The Georgia Assembly worked with the Secretary of State to basically give counties discretion on that, and so not surprisingly, most this is kind of known in politics that Democrats tend to vote more early, and Republicans tend to vote more on election day, and so it's not surprising that Democrat-led counties would also be more inclined. Basically, the Assembly allowed counties to open as early as Saturday, the 26th, but no later than the 28th. And so, again, not surprisingly, you'd see Democrat-led counties open as early as possible, and Republican-led counties tend to open later.
What was your thoughts on the court case regarding these early voting? Did you get to hear about that at all?
I'm not sure about the specific court case, but I would say that we'll hear there will be some consternation around, in some of these counties. Again, there are some other kind of discretionary practices that are given to counties that you'll find that basically a lot of kind of blue counties will push the envelope on certain things that Republican counties won't push the envelope on early voting or absentee voting, for instance. And so, there will probably be some consternation or sort of some slightly incongruent practices across the state, which are it's a bit it's not totally unique to Georgia. A number of other states do allow kind of county by county variance, slight variance within rules. But in such a heightened state like this, where such divide, blue counties versus red counties are pretty stark these days, you'll see those contrasts really amplified, I guess you can say, in this short voting window. I do think that it's probably the biggest variation here. The two biggest variations we'll say are, one, whether those Kemp Warnock unusual voters come back, which my personal feeling is that they are less likely to return to the ballot. And then secondly, basically, are the Northwest and Northeast Georgians, which are heavily Trump country, they did not come back at a large enough rate in the runoff in 2020, or technically in January of 2021. So that's the other kind of like X factor is will the most conservative voters in Northwest and Northeast Georgia come back out. And so that's probably where the most energy and kind of effort is being exerted.
So I just checked before we hopped on, and 181,000 voters have already voted in this election. What do you think the turnout is going to be? And do you think that Herschel Walker will pull ahead in the end?
Yeah, good question. That is the question of the day. And so I would say there were almost just shy of 4 million votes that were cast in January, and I'm sorry, in November of this election cycle. I think that probably the kind of general rule of thumb is about 80 to 85% turnout. I think if it's an 85% turnout, that probably means that Walker wins. If it's an 80% turnout, I think that probably means that Warnock wins. So basically, I would almost say whoever gets to 1,650,000 votes first probably is the winner here. And I personally think this is a very, very close call. But I actually think that Walker has a very, very good chance of eking this thing out.
You said something very interesting. You said that you think that the Warnock and Kemp voters are going to switch to Walker this time. Why do you think that is?
Well, more specifically, I actually just don't know that they're going to vote. I think that they were voting on based on the governor's race there, and so they were either heavily animated, in favor of Kemp, or possibly animated against the prospect of Stacey Abrams' governorship in Georgia. And I think that was very mobilizing, either for economic purposes or a lot of those voters for school-related purposes. Abrams, throughout the COVID shutdowns, was very animated about criticizing Kemp for reopening schools, but a lot of mothers actually liked that. They liked that there was a short, relatively short shutdown, but kids were back in classrooms very quickly, and Abrams was very, very, very hostile towards that idea. And so I actually think that they were very mobilized on the governor's race, but just for a variety of reasons, were not overly sold, if you will, on Herschel Walker. So I just think that they were more interested in the governor's race than the senator's race in those cases.
So there is a anti-Joe Biden movement going on right now because we've been seeing all the high inflation, and Warnock votes 96% with Biden. Do you think that will make a difference when voters put Warnock and Biden so closely together?
The short answer is yes. I do think that is a compelling kind of tick against Warnock, and it's no coincidence, obviously, that Joe Biden has not been to Georgia. He will not be. He did not come to Georgia during the kind of home stretch of the October-November race, and he also has no plans to come during this runoff. Conversely, interestingly, we are going to see Barack Obama come to town. This afternoon, I guess tonight, there's a Dave Matthews free concert in Cobb County. We're going to see a lot of this kind of celebrity Hollywood, a little bit of New York City, Oprah Winfrey. This is actually I've seen this now 4 different times in the last 6 years here in Georgia. I can pretty much tell you what day each Democrat celebrity is going to come, and what venue they're going to perform in what county. There's a playbook to this now, and so we'll see. Will Ferrell come out in probably another 9 or 10 days, and Alyssa Milano will be here probably next weekend. You can kind of set your clock by it.
Herschel Walker is actually a little bit of a celebrity himself, as he was a famous football player. I'd like to know, what do you think makes Herschel Walker stand out as a conservative candidate against Warnock?
It's a good question, and I think it's a particularly relevant question because he's known, for kind of in public circles, but not necessarily for political or kind of public policy positions, right? So he wasn't elected office. He didn't take. He was essentially a motivational speaker after he left being a football player, and so he's spoken to corporations across the country. He's a part of veterans. He's a co-owner in a company with some veterans, and then he also has he and his family have a a nonprofit that serves veterans. So he is somewhat known in certain circles for some kind of positions that I guess could have some public policy implications. But for the most part, he's just been kind of a public figure, like you would think of any other athlete or musician or, maybe movie star or something. And so it's taken a little bit of time. His name recognition is extraordinarily high. Can't get any higher, basically. But it's taken a while for people to be convinced either to learn what his public policies are or to become comfortable with just kind of his character and integrity. And that's not not uncommon for a public figure that then tries to kind of segue into public service. Is people know their name or their reputation, but they're still, the jury's out on whether or not they trust him. They know him, but do they trust him? And so that's what Herschel Walker's campaign is trying to do right now, is trying to kind of bond his views with voters. And he speaks constantly, actually, on matters of faith and on certainly matters related to life. I mentioned veterans, on kind of first responders, the firemen, public, various other kind of public servants. And so I think that the message is getting around quickly and is doing well. And I think more and more people are kind of getting comfortable and kind of familiar with him and kind of his opinions, more so than just, whether he scored touchdowns on Saturday or Sunday.
He just put out an ad with Riley Gaines, who is known for speaking out against the issue of having to compete against transgender people in sports, and did an ad specifically saying we want to keep women in sports. What is your thoughts on that? And do you think that that is a big issue in Georgia that is going to make a difference when people come out to the polls?
Well, it certainly is it's become kind of a hot button issue. I mean, across the country, not just in Georgia, and I would say in rural areas, that's actually probably a little bit more of an animating topic or subject. And so, in particular, the Atlanta media market kind of stretches up to the border of South Carolina and up towards the border of Tennessee, and then over to the border of Alabama as well. And so I think he's particularly trying to kind of reach out and communicate in a real, compelling kind of fervent way, an absolute way to those voters, especially kind of in rural areas. Again, kind of the congressional 14th district, the congressional 9th district, and the congressional 11th districts, which are all around Atlanta. They kind of bleed into suburban Atlanta, but they really are exurbs and rural areas. And I think that's what that message is especially kind of targeted towards.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're going to be praying for Georgia.
Well, please do, and I'm glad you're here in Georgia for a few days here, and we look forward to good news on December the 6th.